afternoon. I invite you to the webinar of Indic today. This is the second in the series of Reading History Right. In today's seminar, we have host Shefali Vaidya, who will be in conversation with Anish Gokhale. We are essentially have attempted to start the series with an effort to understand what is history, what should be written, what should be read. In the first session, we had a discussion with Sahana Vijay Kumar, who had written a book on Kashmir and the current socio-economic politics in Kashmir. In today's session, we have a young and upcoming author, Anish Gokhale, who is going to be, who has recently published a new book called Battles of the Maratha Empire. I shall share on the screen his latest book, Battles of the Maratha Empire. And we will be talking today about what has been the narrative of the Maratha history in our publishing industry. What are the different historians who have written and actually say? What are the parts of the history of the Maratha Empire which have not been written much or not discussed much? What is the reason to do so? And in today's discussion, Shefali is also going to discuss a little bit about the aspect of who should write history. In the recent weeks, there has been much discussion in media about who is entitled to talk about history. And we have seen a lot of discussions about people like True Indology, who are not given the correct place hold in writing history, or other upcoming authors who are not being heard because they are not quote unquote historians in the traditional sense of things. So these are some of the questions that we'll be discussing. I hand over to Shefali to continue the discussion.
Thank you so much, Yogini. And it's indeed a pleasure to be in conversation with Anish Gokhale. I've read his books, and he's definitely a prolific writer. And I think this is your third book, right, Anish?
Yes, correct. Third book.
Okay, yeah. And you have handled very diverse subjects like the Maratha Empire. Then you moved on to Assam. Your second book was about Lachit Borphukan. And now you are talking about the most famous battles of the Maratha Empire, which is a very fascinating subject. But let me begin at the beginning and ask you the question which I think most people ask you in interviews. It's like, what is a merchant navy officer, somebody who is in charge of navigation in merchant navy? What is a merchant navy officer doing with history writing?
So once again, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Indic Academy, and thank you to you also for organizing this webinar on Maratha history. So, as you mentioned the question as to what brought me into history, it has been my hobby right from childhood to read. I've read a lot of books, and also it has been a hobby to do trekking and hiking, especially after 10th or 11th standard. So trekking and hiking actually got me into Maratha history, got me interested because all the hill forts you see, Rajgarh, Raigad, Pratapgarh, around Maharashtra, they piqued my interest. And once I had read a couple of books, of course, that interest kept going up. And eventually led to my first book, that is Sahyadris to Hindu Kush, which was written about now 7, 8 years ago. Now I was 24, and I took some time to write it because I wasn't very sure as to how well is it going to be received. But my first book came out, and after that, of course, I got the confidence to write more and read more about it on historical subjects, which led to the second book, that is of Lachit Borphukan, which I've titled Brahmaputra. And in the same vein, now I have my third book, that is Battles of the Maratha Empire.
The third book is very fascinating, actually. And in the book, you have dealt with topics which are of a lot of interest to history enthusiasts and also to common citizens alike. For example, the very first chapter deals with Shivaji Maharaj and the science of hill forts. Anybody who has done any trekking in Maharashtra, or anybody who has visited even a single hill fort of Shivaji Maharaj, will understand what a masterful planning goes into the maintenance and building of a hill fort. So would you like to talk a little about it?
Right. So actually, this third book of mine is more of a top-down effort. Right? The other two books I started by writing, deciding on a topic, and then I decided, this is what the book is going to be about. And then I went about writing that book from page one onwards. As far as Battles of the Maratha Empire is concerned, I have had the privilege and opportunity to write for a number of publications over the past few years, courtesy again Indic Academy. Where I've written for publications such as Swarajya, such as India Facts, such as TFI Post, and over a period of time, I wrote numerous articles. Some of them have found their way into this book, in the sense that they are compilation, because I realized that over a period of 3-4 years, I've actually managed to cover quite a bit of Maratha history. And so this essentially is about compiling some of those articles together. Uh, the first chapter, of course, starts with Chhatrapati Shivaji and his hill forts, since I wanted to have a book that gives a concise introduction to the whole of Maratha history. What usually happens is that people who have read about Chhatrapati Shivaji are ignorant about Chhatrapati Sambhaji and Rajaram. People who have been up to
That's
Raj,
right.
they will find Peshwa Bajirau's exploits something very surprising to hear about. If somebody has read a book about Peshwa Bajirao, he will be totally ignorant about Peshwa Madhavrao and Maharji Scindia. So usually the kind of doubts that get asked by people on Maratha history, to clear all those doubts, you need to supply them with 10 or 15 books, which a
That's
lay
true.
person not really like to go through. I mean, if I am suggested to read 15 books to clear 5 doubts, I'm not going to do it. So in this sense, actually came the idea of the book, that something that covers everything from Chhatrapati Shivaji to the last Peshwa Bajirao is something required today's day and age, which is why I put together this book. And starting, of course, with the hill forts, which is very important. We go up the hill forts, we trek. But what really was the thought process behind it? What made them invincible? Because Chhatrapati Shivaji's forts made him invincible is a very common statement to make. But what was the planning behind them? What thought process went behind it is what I've covered in the first chapter.
Okay, could you talk a little more about it in short? What is that thought process that you're talking about?
Right. So in Ajnapatra is a book which was written much later in 1715 by Ramchandra Panta Amatya, who was actually a junior minister under Chhatrapati Shivaji. And he has written a book called Ajnapatra, which is the administrative system of Chhatrapati Shivaji. And he says that the hill forts are the bedrock of Swarajya. Swarajya is Sarate Durga.
Hmm.
And as to why is this the situation, we understand when we study these forts from a scientific angle as to how were they able to fight Mughals for 27 years, fight various powers, is because Chhatrapati Shivaji made certain changes, made certain innovations which were unique and which really made them invincible fortresses. People before Chhatrapati Shivaji also had those forts in hands, because those hills have existed for millennium
True.
and thousands of years. And even prior to Chhatrapati Shivaji, there were people who were in charge of these forts, but then they lost to invading armies. So Shivaji Maharaj had to do something by which not only did he capture those forts, but he also managed to hold on to them in the face of invasion.
Hmm.
And that is where the true genius of Shivaji Maharaj lies, that he equipped those forts, he made administrative changes, he made structural changes to those forts, which enabled them to last a full 27 to 30 years after he had passed away.
Okay.
So what he made was policy changes. What he made was changes that will not be dependent on the singular person or personality for the success of the forts.
Okay. This is extremely interesting. And in the answer to this question, I think you touched upon something very important. You said that people who study Marathi history do it in bits and pieces. So there are people who are only aware of Shivaji Maharaj, some people are only aware of Peshwa Bajirao, particularly after that movie that came in. Suddenly there was a lot of interest in Bajirao, Even before, people who hadn't heard of Bajirao suddenly wanted to read more about Peshwa Bajirao, the first, Thorle Bajirao. Or some people only hear about Panipat battle, again thanks to a movie. It's so sad actually. But there is no one continuous narrative. People in Maharashtra probably do know, but people outside, they do not know the Maratha history in its entirety. Starting from Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and ending with actually when the British defeated Peshwa Bajirao too, and they became the rulers of India. So there is also this misconception, and you talk about this in the answer to the same question, that when the British came to India, the most commonly held misconception in India is that when the British came to India, the Mughals were still ruling, and the British took over this country from the Mughals, not from the Marathas. So talk a little about this flow of history from Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj to the end of Maratha Empire, and how when the British came to India, what was the map of India?
Right. So like I mentioned, yes, it's correct. Your Maratha history gets studied in silos, especially outside of Maharashtra. For
Yeah.
us also in Maharashtra, it is over a period of time, over 15, 20 years of being in Maharashtra that we managed to somehow read up on this history in bits and pieces. Like what today we read one book, tomorrow some other book. Uh, People who are not from Maharashtra will not tend to read so much of Maratha history. In that they might read one book on Maratha history and then the next book could be on some other topic and then the next book could be on some third topic. So this discontinuity of course exists, which is why this effort has been made that you put everything in one book. Coming to the British, now the British came to India in 1608, that early.
Hmm.
1600 was the year they got the charter from
Hmm.
that king. And then 1608, a ship called Hector dropped anchor off Surat. Very interestingly, the first battle they fought was in 1612, 1612. That early. 4 years after landing on India's shores, they fought their first battle. Not with an Indian power, but with the Portuguese.
Hmm.
This was a very small skirmish, 10 or 15 boats were involved. Nobody was interested in it except the Portuguese and the English battle. The Mughals hardly knew about it. From then onwards, of course, they became traders in India. And the Mughals dominated most of India from 1608 right up to 1705. After this, we have the Maratha Empire. So they have fought a 27-year war, which I have covered in that book. From 1680 to 1707, Aurangzeb himself came to the Deccan,
That's
and
right.
in fact, from 1682 actually arrived here. 1682 to 1707, Aurangzeb was personally present in the Deccan, trying to capture the whole of South India, and he failed to do that. But in the course of the war, he lost thousands upon thousands of men. A lot of money was incurred, expenses were incurred in this war, and as a result, the Mughal Empire became totally hollow from the inside. Then the next 10 years were spent by the Marathas to consolidate themselves. From 1720 onwards, of course, you have this brilliant general called Peshwa Bajirao, who then manages to expand northwards.
Hmm.
By 1737, there is already one attack on Delhi. By 1738, there is a treaty at Bhopal, somewhere near Bhopal, with the Nizam, where the Nizam and the Mughal emperor concede the entire tract from the Narmada to the Chambal to the Marathas. Slightly prior to that, Bundelkhand is also with Peshwa Bajirao. In that, the story of Mastani takes place, but that is a side story. The main point is that one third of Bundelkhand comes to the Marathas, and there is a letter by Peshwa Bajirao to his brother Chimaji Appa, where he says that now Maratha horses have reached all the way up to Yamuna.
Hmm.
So You can see within the reign of Peshwa Bajirao, the Marathas managed to reach Yamuna, managed to reach Delhi. After him, there is Nanasaheb Peshwa. During his rule, of course, the Maratha Empire expands all the way to Lahore and Attock. And on the east, we have Raghuji Bhosle of Nagpur, who extends his kingdom and Maratha rule up to Cuttack, which is in Orissa. And in fact, the province of Orissa is given up to the Marathas in 1751 and it stays with them right up to 1803. So, by and large, when the British win Plassey in 1757, the picture of India is that everything from roundabout Tungabhadra in the south, in fact, even further south of that, north up to Attock region, and east up to
Yes.
Cuttack region is with the Marathas. So about 70% of the landmass is Maratha dominated, and the Mughal has been reduced to a titular ruler.
That's right.
Now I come back to the Mughal ruler. Uh, of course, 1761, there is a theory, I mean, it is quite possible would have happened, is that the Mughal emperor would have been removed and a Peshwa or his appointee would have sat on the Delhi throne, which of course did not transpire because the battle was lost. A very interesting thing happened between 1761 and 1772. 1764 is the Battle of Buxar, which was fought at a place called Buxar in Bihar. Now, this is very common knowledge that the British under Clive, they defeated the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam and the Nawab of Awadh. The combined forces of the Nawab of Awadh and the Mughal Emperor were defeated at Buxar by the English. It is very interesting that what happens in the 7 years after this Buxar. It's something that is totally absent from our textbooks. Is that Shah Alam continues to be in Allahabad because after Panipat, Najib-ud-Dawla takes hold of Delhi and there is no post for Shah Alam left. So now Shah Alam is in Allahabad waiting for the English to take him to Delhi. He's waiting for Robert Clive to take him all the way to Delhi. And this doesn't happen for 6-7 years. Eventually, it is Marji Sinde or Marji Sindhia who takes Shah Alam to Delhi and puts him back on the throne as a titular ruler. Further on, we find in 1788, the Maratha flag is actually flying on the Red Fort and it continues in 1803. And it is the British who managed to defeat a Maratha army, which I have covered the Battle of Laswari and Battle of Delhi, who managed to defeat Maratha armies in North India to take control of Delhi, Aligarh, Agra, and all these places. In fact, in 1803, we find, in 1857, of course, we find that Bahadur Shah Zafar is feted very royally for, being a freedom fighter, and the Mughals fought against the British, etc., etc., is a big narrative that is put in front of us for 1857. In 1803, a very different thing happened, which is not very early, about 50 years prior. The British were actually called into Delhi by the Mughal emperor, and the Mughal prince Akbar II went out of the Red Fort and received General Gerard Lake into the city and gave him a red carpet welcome with a trumpet and band and a procession to the Red Fort, where the Mughal granted him titles like Bahadur Fateh Jang and other such sounding things, after which the Mughal emperor came under a British pencil from 1803. So this is how we find that the British actually were fighting the Marathas, not only in North but also South India to capture them, to capture India from the Marathas.
See, from what you have said, and this is the accurate historical reading actually, but unfortunately, the narrative again in the mainstream historical narrative that has been pushed down our throats by the historians of India is that the defeat of Panipat is like the end of it. It broke the back of Marathas. After that, nothing significant happened. And they don't even give due respect to somebody as brilliant as Peshwa Madhav Rao. who actually rebuilt the entire kingdom, and also the implication of the Battle of Panipat, that from then on there were no more invasions from Afghanistan and India, and it's no small feat. So why do you think there is this agreed that the Battle of Panipat is a watershed moment in Maratha history, but Maratha history does not stop there. So why is that one defeatist moment being tom-tommed as the major thing in Maratha history? Why do you think that is it deliberate? Is it what do you think is the rationale behind it?
Right. So first, Panipat was a huge defeat for the Marathas, and not just for the Marathas, but for the whole of India, in fact, because a very different kind of politics would have happened if that victory had gone other.
Yes, yes.
Only politics wise, but even military progress
Yeah,
wise.
the whole map of India today would have been different if that battle was not lost.
Again, it is a combination of two things. One is having this defeatist attitude, where you find that in especially the era from 50s to 70s, 80s, a lot of books are written about how India was defeated by various
Hmm.
invasions, which are now slowly started changing.
Hmm.
Now it again started changing back to kind of literature that was being published in 20s and 30s,
True.
which talk about a more victorious, response to invasions. So these basically is one reason that a defeatist. One thing is that we ourselves have made Panipat a big issue. So it has again stayed within its silo, within its own compartment of Panipat.
Hmm.
A book on Panipat will never talk about the rejuvenation after Panipat.
Yeah, that's true.
So a person who picks up and reads only about Panipat will not have any knowledge about what happened 10 years after that.
That's right.
And Peshwa Madhav Rao's rule is very significant because it starts in 1761 uh, to end of it. Very young, he's only 18 years old at the time. In fact, only 17. And he manages to steer this Maratha Empire back to its previous situation of the previous power within this 10 years of rule from 1761 to 1771 72. The Marathas regain their pride and honor in North India and South India. But again, why it is not taken, why it is not known, one is this defeatist mentality because we cannot show victories.
Hmm.
Second is, of course, Panipat, Peshwa Madhav Rao, and Maharji Shinde. These three topics exist in three different books. And a book which will say that Panipat was a defeat, but Peshwa Madhav Rao and Maharji Shinde were the reasons of the Maratha rejuvenation will not come together. So,
Hmm.
narrative created stops at Panipat and doesn't progress further.
Okay. It's sad, no, that some of our most glorious chapters of history were deliberately hidden from us, and instead we ourselves only started showcasing the worst battles. Sure, that did happen, but we also had moments of great victory. You mentioned about the Maratha Empire being spread from Attock to Cuttack. So could you talk a little bit about the Maratha impact on Odisha and particularly on the Temple of Jagannath?
Right. So basically, the Maratha invasions of Bengal and Orissa at the time in 1740s, Bengal Subha meant what is today's West Bengal, what is today's Bangladesh, today's Orissa, and parts of Bihar. So this
Mm-hmm.
is what Bengal meant during those times. In fact, this is what it continued as right up to British times also. The much later that we found that the uh, separate provinces of Bihar, Bengal, and Orissa. So this huge province was under one Nawab of Bengal, Alivardi Khan. And the Maratha entry into Bengal actually is the result of some infighting within the uh, Mughal kingdom of Bengal. We had one Persian general from Orissa. He was a Subedar of Orissa. He came up to Raghuji Bhosle of Nagpur. He was around 1742, I believe. And he, in fact, invited Raghuji Bhosle into Orissa because there was a lot of anarchy over there, and it did not want the Nawab of Bengal's rule. From 1742 to 1751, we have a time period where the Marathas have done about 10 or 15 raids into this province. And this is where Bargirs come in. Now, the Bargirs are basically what we call today non-state actors. See, the Marathas did not have a proper professional army since the days of Chhatrapati Shivaji. Shivaji Maharaj had built a very strong professional salaried army. That did not exist 100 years later because of various factors. And so the Bargirs, of course, were part of the Maratha army, but at the same time, not really controlled by them. So they were something like, your forces or the people you require to do kind of jobs which the normal army cannot do. And unfortunately for Bengal, the Maratha period did not extend beyond this Bargir raiding. Because in 1751, the Bengal Nawab gave up Orissa to Raghuji Bhosle.
Okay.
And Bengal was no longer troubled by the raids of Marathas. In Orissa, of course, we find that the Jagannath Puri temple now came under Maratha control. Now, very interesting about the Jagannath Puri temple is the history of this temple in the 500-600 years preceding 1751. We find that the temple was attacked no less than 18 number of times, 18. 18 times the temple was attacked by various forces. 15 of those times were some or the other Turkic or Afghan ruler. I'll try to sound politically correct here. So I call them Turkish and Afghan rulers, but we know what I'm talking about. So 16 times those raids were by this. Couple of times were by actual Hindu rulers. The first time was the raid by Hindu ruler was sometime in the 9th century. What he did was that he simply took the idols away into his own territory, which was somewhere in Andhra Pradesh, and installed them over there. All the invasions involving the Afghan rulers were about attacking the idols. And in fact, it was not just about the wealth of the temple, it was actually about the idols because Jagannath Puri temple idols have something known as Padartha. And that is the actual holy object which nobody knows what it looks like because even the priests at the temple have to do that ceremony blindfolded.
That's right.
Replace the idol, replace the wooden. The ceremony, I think it last happened 2001, 2002 something.
No, couple of years also it happened. It happens when the Ashada comes in the Adhik Mas.
That is 2015. I can't remember that. Anyway, sir, 18 invasions, and every time you find that the idols or the Padartha was taken away, it was taken away either south, many times it was taken to Chilka Lake, and some of the invasions we find that the invaders, they went to the temple, ransacked it, they find that the idol is not there. Some of the invaders, such as Kala Pahad, actually traveled all the way to Chilka Lake to chase that idol and to burn it. So this is the kind of history that precedes the Maratha occupation of Odisha.
That's
1692, in fact, Aurangzeb gave an order for leveling the temple of Jagannath Puri to the ground, which is already done in Mathura and Kashi. Now he gave an order, but in 1692 he was totally occupied with the war against the Marathas. So some subordinate officer went there to do this job and he was bribed out of it somehow. 1732 was the last time that an actual attack took place, which is very close to 1751. 1732 we find that the last time an invader actually came and troubled the temple. Every now and then you will find that the temple was not troubled when the local ruler realized that the pilgrim revenue isn't coming in. So we have to realize that when the Marathas take over Jagannath Puri, they are actually going to undo something that has been happening for past 800, 900 years and has seen 18 invasions. Okay, so now under the Marathas, the Jagannath Puri temple got a complete rejuvenation. Plenty of gold donations were given by Raghuji Bhosle to the temple. Uh, there was a village called Daspalla where the timber was very good. This timber was used for making the chariot wheels of the
Okay.
Jagannath Rath for Yath Yatra. The Bhosles of Nagpur made that village tax free
Okay.
so that they can, make better wheels and supply them to this Rath Yatra. There were Bhog and Annakshetras established by the Maratha rule. The Marathas improvised the road coming from Bengal into Jagannath Puri. And in fact, you find that during this period of Maratha rule, Bengali merchants have also donated land and money to the Jagannath Puri because of the changed condition, which made it a much more secure place.
True. Very
There
true.
was also from 1760, of course, you find that 1760 up to 1803, we had Maratha governors in Odisha.
Hmm.
1751 to 1760, for 8-9 years, we had the former Mughal rulers, Mughal governors allowed to continue with their jobs. 1760
Okay.
onward, that Raghuji Bhosle, or in fact the Bhosles of Nagpur, appointed Maratha governors into Orissa.
Okay.
The entire time Jagannath Puri had a cultural rejuvenation. There were donations made for the Yath Yatra, there was donations made for the Julana festival, uh, and there were in fact even donations of gold and silver idols made by one Gosavi. If you go to the Jagannath Puri temple, you find there is a big pillar on front of the main gate. It's
Hmm.
called the Arun Stambha.
Hmm. That's
Arun
right.
Stambha has been brought by the Marathas from Konark to Puri. Konark is about 1 hour drive. So the
Okay.
charge, in fact, the claim that the British discovered Konark is wrong.
Hmm.
It is similar to the claim made by British regarding Hampi or even Angkor Wat for that matter.
True.
Also, in Hampi also you find that people were actually going and worshipping the Narsimha Murti, which is today very
That's right.
famous.
Yeah.
The
So this
Narsimha,
so-called I am very wary of this subject, this statement that this thing was discovered by the British. Of course, the local people were always aware. Even in Ajanta, the locals were aware that there were caves. It's okay that these guys have went and made a systematic study of it and then brought it in front of the world. That's okay, but that doesn't mean that they discovered it. Local people did know that they existed.
I believe the benchmark for this statement is British discovered Mahabaleshwar. Yes, actually. And it is impossible not to notice Mahabaleshwar once you are somewhere on the Panchgani plateau.
That's right.
Which is very close. So, I mean, it's very difficult to say that discovered. So, coming back to Marathas, they of course knew that that Konark temple existed, and Konark temple back then, even at the time of Marathas or today, is basically a defunct temple. There is no idol of the sun god inside,
Hmm.
and it is actually a very good example. Konark and Puri. If you go to Konark, which is basically a tourist site,
Hmm.
because it is not a functional temple. It works as a
That's
tourist
right.
site. Its only revenue is people coming to click photographs and going back.
Yeah,
Puri is a living and breathing place with a functional temple.
that's right.
When you see the contrast between a ruined temple like Konark and a living city like Puri, you understand the importance of activities done by somebody like Devi Ahilyabai Holkar.
Hmm.
Is
That's
that
right.
temples do not just mean a place of worship, but they actually, like today, they in fact were about the entire system, about the entire town, and they supported and they rejuvenized a lot of industries around themselves. And same case is with the Puri temple, which the Marathas in their tenure from 1751 to 1803 really managed to rejuvenate. And unfortunately, nowhere
Hmm.
near that Arun Stamba will you find a simple two-line plaque saying that the Marathas brought this pillar from Konark. Uh, Nowhere at Jagannath Puri temple will you find a mention that the Marathas did the cultural rejuvenation of the province. You will not notice it at the Konark temple also, which of course is a very sad thing, and hopefully it changes.
Uh, uh, Okay, now let me come to a slightly different topic. You said in this, just in this answer, that Aurangzeb had given a firman, a royal order for the demolition of the Jagannath Puri temple, just like he had demolished the temples of Mathura and Vrindavan, right? And we have countless firmans of Aurangzeb banning music, imposing jizya on Hindus. Everybody knows that he was a fanatic and he hated kafirs with a vengeance. There is enough evidence. He himself has left enough evidence. And yet, you will find, and recently there was a controversy, I will deal with it very briefly. In Lok Satta, the head of the department of the history department of Pune University wrote an article in which he presented a document which was not even a royal farman, it was some document in Farsi, which was a small administrative order. And on basis of that order, which was related to a local issue, she made a statement that Aurangzeb, she implied a statement that Aurangzeb was not a Hindu hater and he was, he respected temples, he respected Hindus and all that. And after that, there was a controversy. People gave proofs and said that this is not a royal farman and all of that. But a raging controversy erupted where people with degrees, PhD degrees, and who were teaching history in different institutions, they came out with this position. Many people, not all of them, but many people came out of this position that only formally trained people can be called historians, and only they have the right to talk about history or to write about history or to write books, and only they can be taken seriously. It doesn't matter if you read the same primary resources that they do, if your study is as important or even more than theirs, but just because they have a PhD and they are teaching history in some institutions, only their version of history should be considered official. Do you agree with it?
Okay, I'll make a couple of statements here. First thing is that most of these people, degree holding historians, they don't have to deal with other real world problems such as a boss, subordinates, the market. Okay. Now, secondly, I've been merchant navy for about 6, 7 years now. I topped my class before I joined the field. Okay. And I felt I knew everything because I was 20 something. I joined my first ship, and on my first day, the captain called me and he said, "Okay, what was your training? This, that." I said, "I topped the class." He said, "Okay, fine. You take that certificate, fold it, and keep it aside." Because this is a different field altogether. And what you do in your job now onwards is what's going to matter. Secondly, uh, if your subordinates, there is a hierarchy in any profession, there is a hierarchy. I don't know about historians, but in any profession there is a hierarchy. Is that there is somebody who is above you, there is somebody who is below you. Of course there is a point where you are above everybody else, and then that's a different place altogether. But more or less about hierarchy, uh, if your subordinates have to teach you something, or if your subordinates find out that you don't have the requisite knowledge for a job, everybody who's in the corporate sector or in any kind of job knows what that feeling is. At the same time, why do you respect your seniors? I am second officer in merchant navy. Now I respect my chief officer and my captain. Why? Because he has a certain knowledge set, a certain skill set which I simply don't have. There are going to be times when I am going to be not be there experience wise or knowledge wise to tackle a situation when I have to call my seniors to help me out. And it's not just my field, I think this is common for all the fields. Point
That's
on
right.
that your knowledge has to show yourself to be superior to the others.
Okay.
Now, if these historians, when lay people are discussing something, if these historians can come there and show that their knowledge or their sources, their skill set is something above the rest of us, then of course they will have natural respect. Your respect cannot just be earned by showing a degree. I mean, you have to show, okay, I am more knowledgeable than you. But now what you find, the doctor somebody comes and an XYZ somebody comes and rips them apart on Facebook. I do not know how to respect such a fellow. Okay, I understand that if doctor somebody comes and he says something, okay, initial respect will be there. But then once that is countered, when that is countered, you cannot say my degree is important. No, it's not.
Hmm.
Your degree is important only up to a point. Like my degree was important till I got promotion. After that, I had to manage on my own. No? So
True,
same way.
true. Now, my question is also that, okay, if you're calling yourself a historian, and most of the historians nowadays, they don't do any primary research, right? The primary research, they also base their research or whatever, their research paper based on, for example, if you take Maratha history. So they are also going to read Riyasat Khan Sardesai. They are also going to read Gaha Khare. They are also going to read Jannath Sarkar, and they are only also going to read all the historians who have done tremendous work before. And those historians didn't really care for a PhD or a degree or whatever. They were actually concerned about going through primary historical Aitihasik sadhana and read them and write their books. So these guys are reading their research, which is exactly, and that resource is open for everybody. You and I can also read it. You and I do read, people like you and I. So if I am reading the same resources as somebody with a PhD degree is reading, then how does that degree make that person more qualified to talk about a certain subject if I have read the exact same Kagat Patra that that person has, is my question. This kind of gatekeeping that you're talking about, which is there in every field, I agree, right from writing to academia to wherever, but saying that we are superior just because we have a piece of paper that says doctor something something, and even though you have read the same information, even though you may have done more research on the given subjects, you are not qualified to talk about it. It is that kind of moral superiority, is that kind of attitude, that is what I think there is a real problem with.
Right. Uh, so again, any book is as good as its sources.
Yeah,
That's the basic point. If I write a book with certain sources, it is going to be as good as the book that you write with the same sources.
that is true.
The book can be better if you bring a better source. Right? If
Very
I
true.
write a book based on sources from G.S. Sardesai and you write a book based on, say, the Shiv Bharat, which is a more contemporary source, and you actually put that Sanskrit in the
Hmm.
book, then yes, I will agree that you have more knowledge than me and you have access to knowledge that I don't have, which again I'm talking about creating respect. Simply the degree is not going to bring you that
Fair
respect.
enough.
To create that
Fair
respect,
enough.
showing your knowledge, which is something they are not able to do, which is very funny that historians come on Facebook and Twitter and they get scolded by everybody and then they go back and start saying all these things. So what I would like to say is that people, non-historians, you basically your sources should be in their place. uh, you need to be able to show that your respect has to be derived out of the knowledge you're putting forward in front of people. Either it is something other people have not read, or it is a skill set that other people don't have. Like for example, we find that people who knew Farsi were actually telling them what is written over here.
Hmm.
And
That's right.
important because now you have a skill set which I don't have.
That's
Okay,
right.
and rely on somebody's translation of that Farsi document. You are going to be able to read that Farsi document. Automatically, it means that your knowledge and skill set is something worth respecting and something that will derive respect instead of just having a degree. Your
Very,
degree.
very true. That's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. Uh, Last part, I would like to talk to you about two things. One is there is a very conscious attempt to create a narrative that the Peshpai was a totally Brahminical rule and that it was not fair, and trying to fit in with these days, the woke SJW narrative. But they are not talking that somebody like Malara Holkar, who came from a shepherd community, could become a independent ruler in his own right simply because Peshwa Bajirao first recognized his talent. And his daughter-in-law, Ahilyabai Holkar, did so much of work for Hindus. She didn't do it for Brahmins or for shepherds or for Marathas or for Kshatriyas. So could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Again, come back to the same point is that we tend to see a differentiation from Chhatrapati Rajaram, Chhatrapati Sambhaji, Chhatrapati Shivaji on one side, and then you find the Peshwai on the other side. It is actually one continuous stream, one continuous line of
Hmm.
rulers. And yes, compared to modern times, yes, that Peshwai or the times were more castes, but then there were more castes all over the country.
That's true.
In fact, there are very few examples of somebody from the Dhangar caste managing to become a Subedar.
Hmm.
Very few examples of somebody who was a Shinde managing to become a Subedar. And of course, Maharji Shinde, and before that, right from the time of Nebaji Shinde onward, we find that the Sindhyas have made the biggest contribution to the Maratha Empire. And the Sindhyas
Okay.
to the end, loyal to the Peshwai.
Hmm.
It was in fact combination of Nana Fadnis, a Brahmin, and Maharji Shinde, which managed to thwart the British for a good 25 years in the 18th century.
That's right.
We find that there was a Gaikwad ruler in Baroda, and of course, if they had so much internal problems of caste, it is quite impossible to have built an empire and ruled over it for close to 100 years.
Hmm.
And in fact, except the Brahman Peshwa, we find that most of these rulers are not Brahmins at all. They are from various castes, Marathas and even other castes.
Yeah. And there was a lot of autonomy also given, right? Which is why Indore became an independent Sansthan, Gwalior became an independent Sansthan, Baroda became an independent Sansthan, where the rulers had a lot of autonomy. So it wasn't like it was totally centralized and the people who were sitting in Pune were tightly controlling everything when that were going on.
Right. Over a period of time, it became more and more autonomous.
Mm-hmm.
Depending what time period you're taking. When you're talking about the days of Chhatrapati Rajaram, all these names are already becoming famous in the closing years of that war with the Mughals. And under Chhatrapati Shahu, they are not as tightly bound as under Chhatrapati Shivaji, but still they are more or less under centralized rule.
Hmm.
After Panipat, it becomes much more looser, and
Okay.
over a period of time, the central authority, because of the weakening of this authority in Pune, we find that the various parts, uh, tend to be autonomous administratively, because we find that as late as 1795, you find the Battle of Kharda, where Holkar, Shinde, the Peshwa, even help from the Gaikwad Raghuji Bhosle, that is a different Raghuji Bhosle than the one we talked about earlier. The Bhosles of Nagpur, all of them combined to defeat the Nizam. So this kind of unity exists within the Maratha Empire right up to 1795.
Okay.
Unfortunately, there is a caste-based narrative on it, which is not entirely correct, because you find that the Maratha Empire would not be possible if not for all the other factors. So the success and the decline, both of the Maratha Empire belong to Maharashtra as a whole. In fact, India as a whole.
The other thing that I want to talk, want you to talk about is also the contribution of women rulers. For example, Tara Rani's heroic fight against the Mughals after Rajaram passed on, and also Ahilya tremendous contribution to dharma everywhere, and we see it even today. Everywhere you go, from Kanyakumari to Badrinath to Puri or to Gaya, you will see some temple which has been renovated by Ahilya, some dharmashala, some ghat built. It's tremendous the kind of work that she did in her years that is benefiting the Hindus of this country even today. So could you talk a little bit about that, about Tara Rani as well as Ahilya Bai?
So Tarabai was born in 1674, the same year that Chhatrapati Shivaji was coronated. And as you know, the Mughals attacked in 1680. There was a long war with the Mughals. Chhatrapati Sambhaji got captured and he was killed in a very inhuman manner by Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb, in fact, went so far as to put out his eyes and cut out his tongue and then skin him alive. Then he was left like that for 10-15 days. And the whole aim of this was to demoralize the Marathas, which did not happen.
That's right.
And the opposite happened, in that whatever small differences they had under Chhatrapati Sambhaji, they put aside and they united once again. This was the period between 1690 to 1700, where you have Chhatrapati Rajaram fighting against the Mughals. Now, Rajaram also died 1700 at Simagad. Now it was surmised that the Marathas don't really have a ruler,
Hmm.
because Chhatrapati Shahu, who later became Chhatrapati Shahu, he was under a Mughal prison with Aurangzeb. Rajaram had died. Maharani Tarabai was 25 years old at this point of time, 26 or 25 years old. And she said that I'm going to put my 9-year-old son on the throne and I will continue the struggle. We're talking about the Mughal army facing against a 26-year-old woman. And she, in fact, led the armies personally many times. She sent letters to the various forts that we are going to continue fighting. We are not going to give up as yet on this. Uh, she went to the forts with sword in hand. She knew how to ride horses. She knew how to fight with the sword. And she inspired the men to continue fighting what had been a struggle that had by then become 20 years old. And the entire land was completely finished as part of this warfare. And for 7 years, she managed to fight against somebody like Aurangzeb. In fact, Aurangzeb's last campaign was begun in 1700. He was some 80 years old, and he personally led his campaign in 1700, thinking that now there is Tarabai, a woman, 25-year-old woman on the throne. It is going to be easy for us. But he found out to his surprise that all the forts which he could take within 4 or 5 years went back to the Marathas under the leadership of Tarabai. So Tarabai Shinde, of course, Tarabai Bhosle was a very big influence on the Marathas, and she in fact managed to steer them in the last part of this warfare, which could have gone either way, which could have in fact ended with defeat for the Marathas. And later on, of course, we find that the more equally famous person is Devi Ahilyabai Holkar. Again, talk about how things get separated. To be able to construct those temples all around India, political supremacy has to be established. I think our
Absolutely.
for establishing a Ram Mandir at Ayodhya shows us what this exactly means.
Yes.
With independent India, with a lot of things, finally a mandir is getting built over there. It's something that was not possible in the past 300, 400 years for the simple reason that political supremacy was not with the Hindus. So when you see, it is not a case of she built hundreds of temples. So it is a symbol that the Maratha rule, the achievements of Peshwa Bajirao and Peshwa Madhavrao Maharji Shinde are now getting a coating or a crown, in fact, of cultural recognition. The foundation is political, foundation is military, and having fought this entire land by fighting hundreds of battles, some of which are covered in the book, Battles of the Maratha Empire. Having established this political supremacy, what do the Marathas do with it is that somebody like Devi Ahilyabai Holkar builds hundreds of temples, maybe not hundreds, but many temples, and
Yes.
dharmashalas, annakshetras, and really drives the point home that now the Mughal rule has come to an end, and all these factors, all these institutions which were persecuted under Mughal rule. We had 1692, we are talking about a farman going against the Jagannath Puri temple, and we find that in the 1780s, Jagannath Puri temple gets donations from Ahilyabai Holkar. We
That's
find
right.
that in 1669, there is a farman for demolishing the Kashi Vishwanath temple. And 100 years later, Devi Ahilyabai Holkar has built a temple next to that one.
That's right.
So this is we find that the women were really influential also in Maratha history. Politically also, also, and even in the cultural field, they had a very strong influence. They were not something separate from the men of the households, Maratha rules, and their contribution, of course, is as great, if not greater than others. In fact, of Tarabai Bhosle, the historian Yadunnath Sarkar has written that she achieved so much in 7 years that if she had not been a woman, in fact, the only problem that was that she was a woman. That's why she could not continue ruling as Tarabai Bhosle. She had to go for a regent, and then this led to Chhatrapati Shahu becoming Chhatrapati.
That's right.
And before that, of course, we find that Jijamata, of course, was a huge influence on Chhatrapati Shivaji also. And
That's
coming
right.
to the close of this, we find the Rani of Jhansi.
Jhansi, that's right. It's a full arc actually that starts from Jizamata and ends with Rani of Lakshmibai with everybody in between.
Throughout, we find that women are very important throughout Maratha history.
I think
That's true.
on that note, we need to move on to question and answers. I was going to speak a little bit, but it's been a wonderful 1 hour, and I'm not sure where the 1 hour passed away. So it's very excellent discussion. We've had a lot of response from the attendees too. So instead of asking any questions from my end to Anish, I'll move on to the question and answer sections itself. And I'll read out, I've chosen a few questions. I'll read them out to you. Anish, so Subhashish Datta asks you, in my mind, the hill forts aligned to a defensive posture. They perhaps made it easier to defend territory. Would that be a correct assumption? Does the book touch upon the offensive posture of Maratha kings and the associated strategy?
Right. But your hill forts are meant for offense as well as defense, depending on how they were used. For example, you find that yes, some of the hill forts were for defending the border as such. A very good example of how a fort was used for an offensive measure is the Battle of Pratapgarh, which I have covered in the book, where the fort is used as an instrument to defeat Afzal Khan. It is not just a case of holding out against Afzal Khan at Pratapgarh. In fact, he leaves his defensive posture. His defensive posture is at Rajgarh, which is north near Pune. That is a completely defensive line of forts, well inside his own territories, which he is well stocked, which is well guarded. But that is very defensive thinking. What Chhatrapati Shivaji does is he moves to Pratapgarh. This is at his border. This is a new fort, and now the entire strategy changes, and we find that how he manages to use this fort effectively to launch attack on Afzal Khan's army. So yes, depending on how they were used, the forts were used both ways, defensively and offensively also.
Okay, there's another question by Indranil Shikhare. He asked, why did Marathas keep propping up Mughals in Delhi rather than placing a North Indian dharmic like a Rajput or a Sikh on the throne?
Good question.
Yeah, very good question.
Okay, again, this topic also I've covered in that book as a part.
Yeah, I know the last chapter you have, but it didn't get covered in that discussion, so I took up the question.
Sure, absolutely. Right. So now we had this war with the Mughals. Mughal Maratha war extended from 1680 to 1707. Then we find that the Marathas established themselves, and a treaty is signed by Chhatrapati Shahu under the mediation of the Peshwa Bahaji Vishwanath in 1719. And what this treaty says is that the 6 Subhas of the Deccan belong to the Marathas, is that they have revenue rights over the entire Deccan, and they accept the Mughal as nominal ruler. Plus, they agree to put some kind of forces, 500 or 1,000 soldiers under a Subedar at Aurangabad, who is going to protect the Mughal. And secondly, certain amount of money is going to come to the Marathas. So what it means is that the entire Deccan now belongs to the Marathas. There is a sanad to that effect. Now, why to do this is that the Marathas at this point of time, although they have emerged victorious in the war, they are not yet out of the woods. They cannot afford to start fighting again with whatever remains of the Mughal Empire. So this creates a kind of a nursery, a kind of a safe zone within the Satara Kolhapur region, which creates a basis for the empire. Next, we find that Peshwa Bajirao starts expanding northwards. By 1740, by the time Peshwa Bajirao dies, the Marathas have by law the rights to collect revenue from the entire region north of Narmada up to the Yamuna. And by and large, this rule expands. We find again in the 1750s, 1737, the Marathas reached Delhi. 1750s, again this rule is reiterated. 1772, Mahadji Shinde brings the Mughal emperor to Delhi and puts him on the throne. So why continue doing all this? First thing is that when the Marathas start going northwards, the Mughal Darbar consists of Irani and Turani factions. A large number of second-rung Mughal nobles are actually Afghans, Turks, etc. One thing the Marathas want to guard against is all these Mughal remnants who have now become second Nawabs and Subedars and whatnot to combine under some religious banner and try to again attack the Marathas. So they need to play off the Irani-Turani faction against each other and take as much as the empire from the Mughals as possible before finally going for the final blow. It is not so easy that you remove the Mughal and put somebody in his place because obviously that's going to create a lot of trouble all around Delhi. Now, Delhi at this point of time is a very risky and place full of anarchy. There are Afghans attacking from northwest. There are Marathas attacking. There are some the other Rohilla or some Pathan Nawab from today's Uttar Pradesh. So unless the entire country is settled, there is no point in going and replacing the throne and just catching hold of a hot potato. Especially when the capital has de facto capital has now moved to Pune. In fact, Tukoji Holkar in 1770 writes a letter that the Marathas attempted to remove the Mughal at around the time of Panipat, which is why a lot of these Muslim Nawabs then had to rally to the banner of Ahmad Shah Abdali. We find that the Afghans are also in a position to replace the Mughal, but they do not do so. Nadir Shah actually sits on the throne, but eventually gives up the throne. And then the British also do the same. So we find the multiple powers have not touched that throne because it has some importance and they do not want to get hold of an anarchic city. I believe that covers the question.
Okay. I will take a last question. I think you are also quite tired after speaking for 1 hour.
One more topic regarding the Sindhis and the British, which is Sindhia and the British. In something, there have been a bit of a controversy on this also in the past, that the Shinde household has been pro-British. So I actually wanted to touch maybe 1 or 2 minutes on that. Is that possible?
Go ahead.
Right. Mainly because of this movie that we have, Manikarnika, in which they showed that the Shinde ruler at Gwalior was entirely pro-British, and that has got a corollary that the British and Sindhias were always in alliance with each other. So a bit of history over here. One thing is that we're talking about 1857. Couple of years prior to that, we had somebody called Baijabai Shinde. And what she did was that she tried to get a lot of saints towards Mathura. And Baijabai Shinde actually tried to sow the seeds of the 1857, a couple of years prior to it, by trying to get all these Mahants and saints together at one place in Mathura. In 1857, talking about Rani Lakshmi Bai, she went to Gwalior from Jhansi. And the general narrative is that she had to fight for the fort of Gwalior for 3 days. And then after fighting for 3 days, she entered the fort, which is not entirely correct. What really happened was that Jayajirao Shinde actually came out of the fort. He knew his army was entirely anti-British. Even then, he came out of the fort with his entire army to fight Tatya Tope, with the result that on the battlefield, nobody fought anyone, but the entire Gwalior army went to the side of Tatya Tope. And what this shows is that he had a sort of tacit understanding, a tacit support for the revolutionaries. And so the charge that these Indias were entirely in cahoots with the British is totally wrong. And before that, the Scindia household fought against the British at Laswari, Delhi, Asai. In fact, most of the battles of the Second Anglo-Maratha War, which decided India between the British and the Marathas, were fought by these Indias. And before that, also in Vadgaon, we find Maharji Shinde fighting against the British. So this is one point I wanted to cover in the talk here.
Okay. I think we have one last question and then we'll wind up by 6:10 because we have another webinar coming up of Indica Yoga. So Yogesh Athavale asked, Anish, you've described that the British were fighting the Marathas from north to south in the latter decades of the 18th century and early 19th. I think it's 17th and 18th, not 19th. Then why did the Marathas align with the British and the Nizam of Hyderabad in 1799 to wage a campaign against Tipu Sultan of Mysore in the Battle of Srirangapatnam?
Yeah. So this basically was a result of a treaty, triumvirate treaty signed between Nana Fadnis, British and the Nizam, which had its origins in 1791, at a point when Tipu Sultan was considered an enemy of the Marathas. Of course, Tipu Sultan did a lot of many things which were not in tune. In fact, not just Tipu Sultan, but the Marathas were opposed to Hyder Ali also, his father. And Madhavrao Peshwa has scored a number of memorable victories against Hyder Ali. This was a political alliance made for the purpose of defeating Tipu Sultan, which resulted in the Srirangapatnam raid of 1799.
Okay. So with this, we will wrap up today's webinar session. We are looking for some new authors, reviewers to review Anish's new book. So any of the attendees, if you have already purchased and read the book, now that you've had a chance to also interact with Anish, I would urge you to write a review of the book for us for Indic today. And we shall be announcing our next session soon in the next couple of days. Please do keep reading our website, www.indictoday.com, and log into our next session also. Thanks a lot, Shefali, for coming on this session and having a conversation with Anish. Thanks, Anish, for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Yogini. Thank you, Anish, and all the best, Anish, for your future endeavors.
Thank you. Thanks, sir.